This video is sponsored by War Thunder. Stick around to find out more. Since Lethal Company's initial release on October 23rd of 2023, the game has changed quite substantially. While its core gameplay, the loop of finding, collecting, and selling loot with friends, has remained the same ever since its earliest versions, the world of Lethal Company has grown significantly in terms of its selection of environments, the roster of its enemies, and of course, the depth of its story. Indeed, it's no secret at this point that just beneath the game's surface, there's a rich history of war, interstellar colonization, Lovecraftian horror, and corporate control built into this unassuming little experience, with the lore as a whole running so deep, in fact, that it's become a regular topic of discussion on this channel, especially as new updates bring even more world building for us to grapple with. In recent months, additions such as the new mineshaft interior, which finally provided us with a canonical look at the insides of moons such as Titan, the Man-Eater, a new creature equipped with its own backstory, and the ever-enigmatic opening cutscenes have been the subject of extensive study for those interested in Lethal Company's world building. But while version 60 added a lot of new content, what you don't tend to hear about as much is the lore that this update took away. Indeed, over time, Lethal Company has accrued a small history of retconned content, or content that saw some kind of change or removal past its initial release. If you've watched any of my previous Lethal Company videos, then there might be one such alteration that sticks out in your mind right away: the mysterious removal of text from the Old Bird's Bestiary entry, where a significant portion of exposition regarding the earliest known sightings of the creatures simply disappeared from the version of the text that manifests in-game today. Another example stems from the same update, more particularly the overhaul of the moon Dine, in order to more sufficiently distinguish it from its sister moon Rend. But even the complete reconstruction of an entire moon is a change that, at least in my mind, pales in comparison to what would transpire just one update later. In the very next version of the game, not one, but two new entities would be introduced. Two entities which, at least in my opinion, brought with them some of the most important lore in the entire game. Lore that would help to answer some long-standing questions about Lethal Company's ancient past, and yet something unprecedented would occur. For this update would mark the first, and to this day the only time, where we would see previously added enemies simply cease to exist. That's right, just 2 months after this version's initial launch, both new species would be completely removed from the game. And while I'm sure more than a few of you will remember this event as it transpired, what some of you may not know is that this retcon would leave behind a strange legacy, and a bizarre, lore-related paradox that still remains unsettled even to this day. So I figured it was about time that we took a stab at it. That's why today we're going to be taking a trip back to one of Lethal Company's shortest-lived updates, going over the story of just what happened to these two retconned enemies, looking at some of the strange phenomena surrounding their removal, and finally addressing the lore, or lack thereof, that they've left behind. This video has been a long time coming, and I'm excited to finally be covering it in depth, so without further ado, let's explore the lore and legacy surrounding the entities of version 55. But before we get into that, allow me to tell you about today's sponsor, War Thunder. War Thunder is the most comprehensive vehicle combat game ever made, and is now available for free on PC, consoles, and mobile. After a long, hard day of slaving away at the company, why not come home to a game with awesome vehicular action and a variety of modes that are a perfect fit for every type of player? Whether you're craving fast-paced matches with enhanced vehicle performance in arcade mode, true-to-life vehicle combat with realistic mode, or seeking the ultimate challenge with simulator mode, War Thunder's intense realistic graphics, authentic sound effects, and incredibly detailed vehicle models place you squarely within the action. The game has over 2,500 tanks, planes, helicopters, and warships hailing from 10 major nations and spanning more than 100 years of military history. A level of realism that's only bolstered by War Thunder's hit system, which intricately tracks shots and disperses flak across vehicle models in real time, making precision aiming essential on land, sea, or sky. In addition, if you want to stand out on the battlefield, War Thunder's got you covered there too, with a comprehensive customization system including countless camouflages, historical markings, and decorations, including community-made creations for all types of vehicles to ensure that no matter where the fight takes place, you and your vehicles can always look your best. So, what are you waiting for? Join the fight and play War Thunder for free on PC, PlayStation, Xbox, or mobile today by signing up with my links in the description or pinned comment. New players, or those returning to War Thunder after at least 6 months on PC or console, will receive a massive bonus pack including 100,000 Silver Lions, multiple premium vehicles, 50 days of EXP and Silver Boost, 7 days of premium account, 2 more premium rental vehicles, the exclusive Eagle of Valor decorator, and 10 rental backups. Thank you to War Thunder for sponsoring today's video. Make sure to check them out below, and with that, let's get back into the weirdness of version 55. The release of version 55, also known as the Cruising Update, was a very exciting time for the Lethal Company community, both for newcomers and those who had been playing the game since release. The centerpiece of this version, and the feature that Zeekerss, the game's creator, would choose to tease before release, was the addition of the Company Cruiser, a vehicle that promised to fundamentally redefine the way that scrap was collected, especially at a higher level of play. The idea was that instead of ferrying scrap back to the ship piece by piece like ants, an entire team could simply load into the Company Cruiser, park outside the entrance, bring scrap out to it throughout the day, and at the day's end, a driver could bring it, along with all of the passengers, safely back to the ship in one go, saving valuable commute time from the ship to the facility, and therefore allowing teams to spend more time than ever before inside hunting loot. It's ironic then that the other major features in this update would both reside outdoors, and I think it's safe to say that they were, and likely still are, probably the most complex enemies Lethal Company has ever seen. Although not explicitly outlined anywhere in the patch notes, the 2 new life forms were fairly experimental, relying on a form of interplay that's never really been seen before or since. In fact, nowadays, many who are familiar with the update look back at them as a form of superorganism rather than 2 distinct creatures at all. And part of what made this system so interesting is that unlike previous updates, one of these new additions would reveal itself almost immediately once players began exploring the new version. On the first day that the update was live, thousands of company workers would touch down on various moons in order to experience all that the new version had to offer. And one of the first things they were likely to see early into even the first quota were these strange new maroon-colored plants, which often surrounded the ship's landing location. At their largest, these shrubs would eclipse the height of a player, and unlike other foliage in-game, they could also be scanned, revealing them as the first of the 2 new quote-unquote monsters bearing the official name Vain Shroud. Although Vain Shrouds were large and somewhat menacing though, they were in actuality completely incapable of causing any direct harm to the player, and although their addition certainly wouldn't go without notice, many still wouldn't really know what to make of them. All anyone would have to go off of, at least at first, was the bestiary entry they generated upon being scanned, so let's go ahead and take a look at that. We open, of course, with the classic danger level courtesy of Sigurd, where he astutely observes that this is not in fact an entry denoting a creature as the others are. Throughout the text, we'll see that he's made some other minor edits as well, in typical fashion, and we're also given the shroud's scientific name, Phlebodium ruber, which, in case you're wondering, like many of the other species in Lethal Company, is a name that has its roots in real-world taxonomy, as expanded upon in the entry's opening paragraph. Vain shrouds, also commonly referred to as veins, are a type of rhizomatous fern of the family Polypodiaceae. In ideal conditions, Vain shrouds' fronds can reach a height of 8 feet, though they average 6 foot 11 inches and are 30 to 50 centimeters wide. Their roots are unusually large, and they are somewhat prickly. With their aggressive reproduction and remarkable size, they take up a lot of space, making visibility difficult, and are difficult to remove. They crowd out healthy plants and offer little nutritional value. They are also highly flammable. A strongly correlated mutualistic relationship has been observed between Vain shrouds and the Kidnapper Fox, and for this reason, veins are a danger when they're allowed to expand to great numbers. Due to this and their other harmful effects on many ecosystems and agriculture, veins have been classified as a noxious weed by the ITDA since 2147. Their planet of origin is unknown, and they were first discovered by plant researcher Alex Kurt in in Korot 7b in 2143, before being found on the other side of its same interplanetary system just weeks later. A common myth is that the veins were first spread across planets due to their mild hallucinogenic properties when ingested, and their history is shrouded in mystery. Already, there are a few things that might stick out about this entry. The first and most obvious is the mention of another species, the Kidnapper Fox, which is of course the name of the other creature added within this update, and one which we'll get to soon. But the other thing that you may have noticed is that this article harbors a strange inconsistency, an inconsistency involving Sigurd. As the narrator of the entire B-plot of the game, Sigurd's employment at the company is very well documented. Along with the rest of his crew, Jess, Richard, and Desmond, he's one of the only former company workers that we know to exist. And over the course of 3 months, he penned various journal entries which were later left behind on many of the moons that we visit throughout the game. And once recovered, they help to clue us into a lot of the weirdness surrounding the company. His writings are also some of the game's earliest chronologically, being outdone only by the entry of the Man-Eater, and yet even though it's insinuated that Sigurd did not survive past 1968, the Vain Shroud entry shows that he's, paradoxically, somehow been able to leave comments on an entry of a species that was not discovered until 2143. Now, this actually isn't the first time that an oversight like this has made its way into Lethal Company. In version 50, a similar scenario occurred with the Old Birds, but Sigurd's section was removed when the creatures were brought to the main branch of the game. And also mirroring the early version of the Old Birds entry, we have a short paragraph of text that also seems to have been penned by him here at the end that throws one final wrench into the mix. Wake up. The company laced the drop pod with the seeds. They upsell us for weed killer cause they know we hate this cherry red menace. Sorry, caps. The Weed Killer being referenced here was also a new addition that made its way into the game in version 55. It can be found within the store on the ship's terminal, and if purchased for the low price of 25 credits, the Weed Killer could be used to, well, kill weeds, shrinking and eventually destroying any Vain Shrouds that it's used upon. But all of this only served to make players question things even more. Why was one of the new entities just a harmless plant? What's the benefit of using the Weed Killer on them at all? And assuming that Sigurd is telling the truth within this log, or that his input here is even canon in the first place, why would the company engage in this weird conspiracy to begin with? Well, for many, these questions would remain unanswered for several in-game days, maybe even until the end of the first quota. But as more and more people would get online in the early hours of version 55 in order to experience the new content, we would get our answer as to why the Vain Shrouds were significant in the first place. And it lay, of course, with the other entity mentioned in this bestiary entry, the Kidnapper Fox. As more and more in-game days elapsed, there would be a noticeable trend on moons that already supported the Vain Shrouds. Their numbers would continue to increase at a constant rate. Every day, there would be noticeably more veins than the day before, and at a certain point when enough of them had accrued on a given moon, it would become possible for the Kidnapper Fox to spawn. And when it did, this thing was no joke. It's dawn, the dropship lands on the moon of your choice, and the area is covered in more Vain Shrouds than ever before. At 8 AM, you and the rest of your crew head inside the facility like normal. You're used to the odd red plants by now, and leaving one person at the ship to man the controls, you pay them no mind. Later that day, you and your friends have generated a pile of scrap, and as night draws near, it's time for you to make your way back with the day's very last armload of goods. When you get outside, it's eerily quiet, until a strange noise, unlike anything you've ever heard before, pierces through the silence. You aren't sure what it is, but you begin running for the ship, now in view, and that's when you see it. An alien creature emerges from the Vain Shrouds. It looks a bit like a dog, but its face seems wrong. You don't have much time to dwell on this though, because before you can even react, its long tongue has ensnared you, causing you to drop everything, and after dragging you into the thicket, it severs your head in one swift snap, just as it did with the other 3 members of your crew just moments before. This is the might of the Kidnapper Fox, arguably the most dangerous creature that Lethal Company has ever seen, and in spite of how far-fetched it sounds, the experience I've just outlined was by no means an unusual one. But before we get into that, let's read the info from the bestiary entry that players would have been able to attain should they have been lucky enough to spot this thing and escape with their lives. Scientific name, Vulpes raptor. A large mammal of the family Canidae, the Kidnapper Fox has many unique biological traits. Two of these are its horizontal jaw and unique skull shape, giving it a great biting strength, and its long, frog-like tongue, which can reach even twice the length of its spindly body. They are solitary hunters and mate for life. Kidnapper foxes have a very long, bushy neck and tail with a more reddish coloration, which is thought to blend in well with the numerous Vain Shrouds where it can almost always be found hiding and waiting for prey. The Kidnapper Fox and Vain Shrouds together form one of the most infamously known and unique mutualistic relationships between two invasive species. Together, they continue to spread across planetary systems, stowing away on large spacecraft. Excluding a select few nature preserves, the ITDA has issued a kill-on-sight order for the Kidnapper Fox and Vain Shrouds due to their impact on ecosystems. The Kidnapper Fox earns its name from its aggressive yet timid and territorial behavior, preferring to finish off prey out of sight and usually in the comfort of the Vain Shrouds. It usually chooses to lie low and wait for things to come its way, but if it grows restless, it can use its long, sticky tongue to snatch its prey from great distances and drag them as far as it needs. If there are Vain Shrouds in your area, carry a weapon and do not stray far from others. Its tongue is quite soft and fragile and can be struck easily, forcing it to stop an assault. Today, there are relatively few human deaths attributed to Kidnapper Foxes per year, and most victims are unsupervised children or adults hiking alone. Unfortunately, this entry doesn't completely communicate just how dangerous the Kidnapper Fox really was in-game, and that's because, truth be told, it's clear that the fox was never meant to be as difficult an adversary as it eventually became. At its core, the fox's mechanics are rather simple. When it spawns, the game chooses 2 points. The first is the fox's nest, which is where it will choose to idle anytime it isn't chasing or attacking the player, and the other is what's called the kill spot, which, unsurprisingly, is the place where it drags players in order to kill them. The rest, at least on paper, is very simple. If the player gets within a certain radius of the nest spot, the fox will detect them and begin hunting them down. If it reaches them, it can grab them with its long amphibious tongue and begin dragging them toward the kill spot. If and when it reaches that spot, the player is killed. The fox returns to the nest spot, and the process repeats when another player comes in range. On its own, this is a perfectly sound enemy design, and one that could definitely make for some pretty interesting moments. But the problem is how, when, and where the cycle can actually occur. For starters, the Kidnapper Fox relies directly on the Vain Shrouds to be able to spawn. In the earliest version of the cruising update, there had to be no less than 17 Vains on the chosen moon in order for that to be possible. But the process worked in a very particular way. Every 2 in-game hours, starting at 8 AM and lasting until 12 PM, there was a chance for the fox to spawn equivalent to a float value out of 1, where that float was derived by taking the number of Vain Shrouds present at the beginning of the day and dividing them by 50. In other words, say you touch down on the moon and there are 35 Vain Shrouds present. Well, since 35 divided by 50 is 0.7, and 0.7 is 70% of 1, then that means every 2 hours for the entirety of that day, there would be a 70% chance for the Kidnapper Fox to appear if it hadn't already. Once it did appear, that was it. The game couldn't spawn another for the whole day, which, as we'll soon see, was one of very few saving graces. We know the fox's main behavior loop is very simple, but there are still many factors that made it such a force to be reckoned with. First, and probably most concerningly, since the Vain Shrouds usually spawned either directly around the dropship or within the direct path that the team would need to take in order to reach the facility, this meant that the fox was essentially programmed to spawn camp either the ship or the facility itself. Its nest radius would almost always encompass some key area in some way, and right from the get-go, players were going to have a very difficult time getting to and from these pivotal locations, especially if they were encumbered. The situation would only become more dire over the course of the day though, since for whatever reason, the detection radius was configured to expand infinitely at a constant rate with time, and the only way to lower it was to look directly at the fox from outside of the range. Killing the beast was likely the best option, destruction, but this was by no means an easy task either. It took 7 shovel or sign hits to bring this thing down, which is quite a hell of a lot for a creature that is almost unanimously an effectively mandatory fight if and when it should appear. One of the toughest enemies that players are likely to try and destroy voluntarily are the Nutcrackers, which have a total health of 5 and offer an incredible reward in the form of the double-barrel shotgun if they're killed. The risk to reward ratio is clear, and that's why people choose to undertake the task in the first place. But with the Fox, eliminating it felt more like an unnecessary obligation, and a highly dangerous one at that. Another problematic part of its design was that when a player was grabbed by the Fox, it would force them to drop everything they were carrying, and in many circumstances a player wouldn't have time to pick anything back up again, even if they did have some kind of offensive item that might help them out. If the Fox's tongue was hit by a shovel or sign, it would release the player that was ensnared, but there just weren't a lot of opportunities for that even in the best of times, and in a single player scenario, the Fox was pretty much unanimously viewed as a death sentence. Some of Lethal Company's other creatures that have more team-oriented counterplay often see some kind of minor nerf in single player in order to make them more fair. Such is the case with the Snare Flea. If encountered in a multiplayer lobby, the Snare Flea will cause damage to the player until they're either dead or smacked off by another player. But if you're in a lobby alone, the Flea will instead abandon a player at 1 HP, because otherwise there would simply be nothing that could be done. No such concessions were made for the Fox though, so overnight, single player lobbies became almost completely unviable, especially in the early game. Indeed, one of the only saving graces of this entire scenario was that the Weed Killer could be used to reduce the number of Vain Shrouds on a moon's surface, as to help prevent the Fox from spawning in the first place. Except, as you may have already figured out, removing the shrouds also wasn't quite as it seemed. Remember that the Fox's spawn chance is tied to the number of Vain Shrouds that exist on the moon's surface at the beginning of each day, meaning that if you land on a moon with 40 shrouds, and you and your friends go around and destroy every single one in the first 2 hours, there will still be an 80% chance for the Fox to spawn throughout the rest of the day. The Weed Killer is only really effective at preventing spawns on the following day, which who knows if you'd even live to see. And since Vain Shrouds also grew at a constant rate across all moons in the game simultaneously, if you ever wanted to switch from your current world to another, well, there was a pretty large chance that you'd have to contest with the Fox on your first day of arrival. So as you can probably see, all of these factors simply made the Fox way too difficult to deal with for many teams. And so within the first day of version 55 going live, numerous players would take to the internet to voice their concerns, and to his credit, Zeekerss would be very attentive to this feedback. It wasn't long before a small series of nerfs would arrive that would attempt to rebalance both the spawning and behavior of the Fox in order to make it a more balanced part of the gameplay loop. One of the first and most drastic changes was introducing a new layer in the Vain Shroud spawning process, where a moon that a player had just left would have a 20% chance of being infected at the close of each day. An infected moon would then start spawning Vain Shrouds the same as before, though obviously there was a drastically reduced chance for a moon to become infected in the first place, which would somewhat help in rebalancing the Fox's appearance rates, and later in time this 20% number would drop even further. Another big change was that the Fox was made incapable of actually boarding the dropship. This was a huge complaint from players early on, because there was often very little that could be done in such close quarters, and the ship, obviously, is supposed to be a relatively safe space, all things considered. However, even though these changes were very much welcomed by the community, many players still didn't consider them to go far enough, or to properly address the root of what made the Fox dangerous in the first place. So, when version 60 was released on August 17th of 2024, it was announced that the Fox would be completely removed for further tweaking, taking the Vain Shrouds along with them. As time went on though, and no further information was disclosed about the state of the Fox or the Shrouds, many began to wonder if they were ever going to be re-added at all. And less than a month later, on September 14th, Zeekerss himself would confirm in a Twitter reply that both the Vain Shrouds and the Kidnapper Fox weren't likely to be re-added to Lethal Company in any official capacity ever again. So it was that after exactly 50 days, these two species' reign of terror would finally come to an end. Undoubtedly, the story of the Kidnapper Fox and Vain Shroud's removal is interesting in its own right, but per the usual, my interest more so lies in the ramifications that removal has on Lethal Company's story. And for our purposes today, understanding exactly how and why that removal occurred is very important. We've already read the bestiary entries of both creatures in full, but I haven't exactly provided sufficient context for the claim that I made at the beginning of this video. That claim being that these two entries may just be some of this game's most important for understanding the story, and in fact I would put them right up there with the Bunker Spider and Old Bird's entry in terms of what they tell us about this world. And the reason why is as follows. As some of you may know if you've watched my Lethal Company timeline video, or if you're just someone who finds this stuff as cool as I do, that pretty much the entirety of Lethal Company's story can be traced back to one origin point, with that being the point when the boat first would arrive in the Thistle Nebula, the area of space where the game is presumed to take place. For those who may not know, the boat is a concept mentioned in the lore which we know very little about directly, but which, through context, is understood to be a spacefaring vessel that's very likely responsible for ferrying humanity throughout the stars. The bestiary entry for the Bunker Spider, undoubtedly one of the other most important texts in the entire game, tells us that it was the boat that first seeded life throughout this region of the cosmos, and that life likely consisted of many of the species that we would be familiar with on Earth. As they were dispersed on the various moons, planets, and other celestial bodies of the Thistle Nebula though, these species would be forced to adapt and fit their new environments, which is why most of the entities we see in game today are taxonomically related to real creatures. However, this process as we understand it does seem to present a sort of paradox. How is it that the same exact creatures can exist on virtually every moon simultaneously if we're led to believe that they all evolved independently of one another? And this is the question that the Kidnapper Fox and Vain Shroud bestiary entries help to finally illuminate. Both of these texts reveal in different ways how human intervention could, and very likely is, the in-universe reason why the biospheres of every moon in the game are basically homogeneous. But while each is similar in the catalyst of human contact, they differ in the area of intent. Think about it. We know that Kidnapper Foxes have stowed away aboard spacecraft unbeknownst to human passengers, and this is directly cited as having likely first caused them to spread throughout the stars. This is not altogether different from how invasive species tend to spread in the real world, where an organism somehow makes its way onto a boat traveling from one area or continent to another, and then they can pose a threat to the new ecosystem that they're introduced to. It's easy to see how the same principle could potentially apply to other species in Lethal Company as well, from snare fleas who rely on hiding as one of their main mechanics, to tulip snakes, bunker spiders, circuit bees, and hoarding bugs, just to name a few. The Vain Shroud entry also corroborates this idea of an unintentional spread, but it also highlights how it's within the realm of possibility that humans could have also spread other species throughout the Thistle Nebula intentionally. The Vain Shroud's alleged hallucinogenic properties may not have been the true galvanizing force behind their propagation, but it's easy to see how they could have been, and they aren't the only species in the game that we know was at some point traded or commoditized by humans. Sometime in the past, we're told that the spore lizard may have been partially or completely domesticated, and that their tails proved to be valuable commodities due to their medicinal properties, so it's not an unprecedented assumption that these creatures, along with others such as coilheads, which we know were thought to have been first created as biological weapons, and other potentially human-made or at least human-altered species like nutcrackers, jesters, and more, could have spread in this same fashion. To summarize, the reason that these two entries are so important to the lore is because they help us to understand that the collective biosphere of the Thistle Nebula may not be that different in principle to our own world of Earth. We have species that reach alien soil through man-made means, both intentional and otherwise. We have governing authorities that attempt to control these populations if and when they should get out of hand, and should those organizations fall short, we're even told that just like our own world, there are specific locations set aside explicitly for preservation of species that are threatened through human action. That analog is invaluable to understanding other aspects of this world, and that's why their removal is equally important. Many would suggest that since the Vain Shrouds and Kidnapper Fox have been removed from the game, then their existence, and the lore that came along with them, can no longer be fully considered canon unless Zeekerss comes along and says otherwise. But because of the strange circumstances surrounding them, I actually don't think that this is the case at all, and that's why I believe it's important to take into account the full story behind their removal. removal. Zeekerss fully intended for these two species to be permanent additions to the enemy roster, and should everything have gone to plan, both of them would likely still be in lethal company to this day. So it stands to reason that even though we don't see them around anymore, their existence is probably still canonical. I guess I shouldn't have referred to them as a retcon in the beginning of this video, because when you look at the big picture, this probably just isn't the case. By the same token, it's reasonable for us to assume that a lot of the tenets present in those bestiary entries likely also remains as an intended part of Lethal Company's world building as well, even if it isn't stated anywhere explicitly within the current version of the game. And that's just a fascinating consequence of this whole dilemma, I think, resulting in what I believe is some of Lethal Company's most overlooked lore. All in all, the story of the entities of version 55 is very unique. Nothing quite like this has ever occurred before or since in Lethal Company history, and I certainly think it makes for an interesting discussion. In spite of the problems they may have caused for some players, it's a little bit sad that these things just aren't around anymore, and doubly so, that Zeekerss has no real plans of bringing them back. That's why, before I end this video, I think that it's only fair to leave you with a word from Zeekerss himself concerning his perspective on the enemies of version 55. This comes from a Patreon post he made on December 22nd of 2024, where the dev reflected on his projects over the course of the year, and began to look forward to the future. This is kind of the first year in a while that I haven't released a new game, but most of it was spent on Lethal Company, which had highs and lows. A lesson I learned is that a strong player/community reaction causes an equal and opposite emotional reaction in me, whether I like it or not, and the Company Cruiser and Kidnapper Fox both kind of tell that story in different ways. The highs for me are the Mineshaft Interior and the Old Birds and Everberon. Hopefully, there are more discoveries like that to come. I, for one, have very little doubt that there will be, and as we look forward to the future of this game, I can't help but find myself excited to see where things go next, with the next inevitable update. And that pretty much does it for this video. I hope that this was an interesting look back at the Vain Shrouds and Kidnapper Fox, both from the perspective of the game's lore, but also in terms of the story of their inclusion and subsequent removal. I think all of that is also very interesting in its own right. I'm eager to see what you guys think of this video, because even though it is ultimately lore related, it is slightly different in focus from what I'm used to. But if people seem to enjoy this, I'd love to do more stuff like it, where we explore the lore, but also the more tangible gameplay related elements simultaneously. And thanks again to War Thunder for sponsoring this video. Remember to check them out using the links in the description or pinned comment to claim your massive bonus pack and get started on PC, console, or mobile today. Either way though, that just about does it for me. Here's me wishing you a happy new year, and I look forward to bringing you more throughout 2025. This is Everberon, I'll see you again soon, and have a good one.